Hey everyone, my name is Allie and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be talking about my 10 favorite books of 2024. I am so excited to talk about these 10 books. I actually wasn't even sure how many books I was going to talk about today until literally right before the video, only because like when I was planning this video out like a week or so ago, I was like, well, maybe I'll do like 15, maybe I'll do 20. You know, I have a lot of books that I really enjoyed last year. However, I just felt like I want to do something concise. I want to do something that is a little bit more like exclusive, you know what I mean? I don't want to talk about every single book that I gave like 4 or 5 stars. I want to talk about my true favorites of 2024. These aren't really in any order, though I have split them up into 5 books that I own physically and 5 that I don't. It just kind of ended up working out that way. I didn't really plan for that to happen, but like I was putting together my list and I was like, oh, I own 5 of these books and I don't own the other 5. So that's just the way that it worked out. I ended up reading 78 books in the year of 2024. And I feel like overall it was a pretty okay year. I felt like I had some really highs, then I had some really lows, and it just kind of ended up being a bit of a we'll see what happens every month kind of year. But I will say, of the books that I ended up reading and really loving in 2024, like these are some of my favorite books of all time. I found a lot of books that will just really stick with me throughout the years. So let's get into this. I'm going to start off with the books that I own physically. And like I said, in no particular order, the first book that I want to talk about is Black Swans by Eve Babbitt. This is a collection of short stories, and I absolutely fell in love with Eve Babbitt this year. I'd been meaning to read her books for quite a while, but I just kept putting them off, and then in 2024 I was like, you know what? This is the year that I finally read her books and really, you know, dive deep into her writing. And I'm so glad that I did. Like, I felt like I really had like an Eve Babbitt summer, which was so much fun. And this is the first book that I ended up starting with and is definitely my favorite so far. I mean, I've loved everything I've read from her in 2024. However, this book is just, it's iconic. It is so LA, so California, and as somebody who was born and raised in California, I still live in California. I love reading from the perspective of other people in California, especially people who were living in California in a time where I wasn't even alive yet. And so I just think that this is super interesting. This really chronicles the Los Angeles vibe from like the 80s to the early 90s. And I love Eve Babbitt's writing style because it was so like, it just felt like you were talking to a friend. Like you were like hearing your really cool, really chic friend talk about her life. And I just absolutely loved it so much. And I felt like this is one of the story collections where every single story matters. Every single story is like a knockout of the park. I can't even decide which one I like the most out of all these stories, because honestly there were so many good ones. And I feel like this is a short story collection that I could see myself going back to time and time again. And also I do want to say that I read this physically, which was literally the way to go. It was the way to go. It was so propulsive and so compulsively readable. I could not put this book down, and whenever I did, I was like just spending my entire time wishing that I could pick it back up. I think I remember one of my favorite stories in this was Coco, and I really enjoyed that one. I believe Tango Land was really good because it talks about her getting really into tango, and it's just so funny to like see Eve Babbitt's writing about so many places that I know and love in LA, and that like I spent a lot of my teenage years going to LA because we only lived about like 2 hours away, and so we went all the time. Like so many weekends we would just like go to LA and have a day trip and go to the Beverly Center or go to a Dodger game or go wherever, and like there's so much of my memories of LA in this book, even though it's from like a different time period. And yeah, highly recommend this book. I could talk about it for hours, but I won't. Just know, if you want to start off with Eve Babbitt's, I highly recommend Black Swans. One of my favorite books of this year. The next book I want to talk about is one that I actually brought with me to my trip to Boston this year, and I read it on the plane there and then on the plane ride back. And I have never, well, okay, I don't typically like to read on planes, only because it's so dark in there and I just have a hard time focusing. But for some reason, I decided to bring this book with me to Boston, and I fell in love with this book. This is In 5 Years by Rebecca Searle, and oh my gosh, I've actually read a Rebecca Searle book in the past and I didn't like it, but this one changed my entire perspective. I loved it so much. It's kind of like literary fiction. It has a little bit of like a speculative aspect to it. Basically, this book follows the main character Dani, and she is really like kind of getting her life all together. Her boyfriend's about to propose, she's getting a new job, her life is going really well, and then one night she has this really weird, vivid dream that she is 5 years in the future, she's with somebody else, she has a completely different life, and it kind of messes with her psyche, and it's just like, it makes her start to question, like, am I on the right track? Am I doing the right things? Am I getting engaged to the right person? And then she kind of forgets about this dream and ends up meeting her best friend's boyfriend, and he's the guy that was in her dream. He's the guy that she was with in her dream 5 years later. And so you kind of get to see like this character grapple with this dream and like her reality and how these two things have kind of crossed over. And you also get to see her grapple with her relationship with her best friend and also come to terms with her best friend's cancer. So yeah, I will say trigger warning for cancer, anything that has to do with that. And I will say this book made me cry like a baby on the plane. And I loved it so much. It really moved me. It was so beautiful, beautifully written, really intriguing, and just like about these like very imperfect characters living imperfect lives and just like being very realistic and very like, I don't know, it was just like so beautifully done. And I love reading books about characters who feel like real people, who make mistakes and aren't perfect. And so yeah, this book really did it for me. It was a perfect book to bring on the plane, even though it did make me cry. It was really fun, and I like another book that I just could not put down. I was reading it physically and I just like could not put it down. The next book on this list is Evil Eye by Etaf Rum, and I absolutely love this book. This is another one that just has really stuck with me throughout 2024. This book is basically a literary fiction novel that follows a Palestinian American woman, and I believe that she's like 29, 30-ish in this book. She is a mother. She's also working as an adjunct professor, and she really wants to go on this cruise trip, and she ends up kind of getting into a little bit of an altercation with one of her coworkers who has said something incredibly racist to her and ends up getting put on probation because of it. And so it really is just about her kind of grappling with her job, with the American culture, with racism, with xenophobia, etc, etc. But it also really is just about this main character and following her life and getting to know her and getting to see her kind of navigate through womanhood, motherhood, her marriage, what she wants out of her life. And she's really starting to ask herself these questions of like, who am I as a person? What do I want? What do I want my life to look like? How do I expect for people to treat me? And I also really love the fact that, like, bringing it back to the like imperfect characters, I really love that this shows this character in such a natural light of like, she's a person, she's human, and she has reactions, and she can get really angry. And I love that because I feel like you don't always get to see characters who are marginalized be angry in books. And I love that. I really loved getting to see that part of her and see that bit of like a reflection in myself of like how I also get angry in the way that she does. And so I really appreciated that, and this book just really loved it. I definitely need to read more from this author. I know that the book A Woman Is No Man is really popular as well, actually probably more popular than this book, so I definitely need to read that one. But I really loved it. I only have the ARC, but I still keep it on my shelf because it really stuck with me this year. The next book is another one that I only have the ARC of, and that is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. I loved this book so much. This is basically kind of like a contemporary fantasy, and it's set in Kentucky, and it follows this young woman, and she is in charge of her brother. I think she's like sort of like some sort of guardian for her younger brother, and her younger brother's really smart. She wants to send him to a good school and a good college. However, they're not very well off financially, and so she ends up taking this job to work as sort of like a housekeeper for one of the very like infamous houses in their neighborhood. And this house has a very interesting reputation. It was like owned by a very secretive author who kind of wrote a fictional book that's very similar to Alice in Wonderland, but like a little bit darker. And then there's just like been kind of like a revolving door of different owners of this house who have all been very secretive and very mysterious. And there's a lot of like weird things that happen in this house. So she ends up becoming a housekeeper for this house, and she ends up meeting the current owner, Arthur Starling, and they kind of have a little bit of like an antagonistic friendship-ish kind of thing at the beginning, but there is a bit of a romance that happens, and I love this book so much. The writing was incredible. The world building was immaculate. I love these characters. They're some of my new favorite characters of all time. I really loved everything. I felt like it all just came together so perfectly. And it's funny because like I started this book and I just like didn't think that it was going to be a new favorite, but I just absolutely ended up loving it, and I felt like it was really well paced. As I said, the characterization, incredible. The romance was iconic. I don't even know what else to say about this book, but the fact that I really loved it. And it had this sort of like very gothic-y kind of feel to it. So if you're into gothic horror, gothic romance, you might really enjoy this book as well. So yeah, I really love this book. Highly recommend it. And it was just such a fun book. It's one that I definitely could see myself coming back to in the future, just to kind of like relive all of the feelings I had. And the last physical book on this list is obviously an Emily Henry book, and that is Funny Story. I feel like I always have to include an Emily Henry book for these like favorite books of the year because she never misses. For me, she never misses. There's just something about her books. She has cracked the secret code for writing the perfect romance book. Every single time, I'm amazed at the fact that she has written another incredible romance book. This one was a lot of fun. It's basically about these two main characters, and they have both recently been broken up with by people who get into a relationship with each other, if that makes sense. And so they are kind of on their own. They end up becoming roommates, and obviously romance ensues. I really love this love interest. I thought he was incredible. He's kind of like a bit of a Nick Miller type of character. He works at a winery, she is a children's librarian, and I'm like, those are two things that I absolutely love. So this book was kind of like a match made in heaven for me. And I don't know, I love the way that these two characters interacted with each other. I loved Miles. I felt like he was just like so emotionally intelligent, and I love the fact that like she is just really running on fumes at this point and is so just like trying to figure out her life, trying to figure out what her life means without her ex-fiance, ex-boyfriend. And I just love the way that Emily Henry writes these kind of like frazzled women who are a little bit aimless and don't really know what direction they want to go in their life, or they're like having a roadblock or whatever. I really appreciate Emily Henry for doing that, for always making her female main characters really complex and interesting and not perfect. And I love Emily Henry's writing style as always. This book was so funny. I loved the characters. I loved the side characters even. And it was just a lot of fun. And there's really never anything too negative I can say about an Emily Henry book. And this one was obviously no exception because I absolutely loved it. Okay, so those were all of the physical books that I owned that I absolutely loved. And so now we're gonna get into my books that I don't own list. And I'm just gonna start from kind of like the bottom up. So kind of from like the most recent book that I've read to the oldest book that I've read. So starting off, I have We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I loved this book so much. I ended up picking it up, I believe, in October, and it's like a Gothic, not really a classic book because it was written, I believe, like 40-50 years ago, maybe even earlier than that, I can't remember. So I don't know if it would technically be considered like a classic, but it's a classic in my heart because it was so incredible. Basically, it follows this young woman and she lives in this house, this mansion, with her older sister and their uncle. And they are a very infamous family within this neighborhood. A few years before the events of this book, their parents were inexplicably died at the house after a dinner. And a lot of people believe that the older sister was the one who killed her parents. And so the town has just like kind of treated them badly ever since then and treats them as kind of social pariahs. And so this family kind of keeps to themselves, and then one day their distant cousin comes to visit and kind of ends up shaking everything up, and this does not sit well with the main character. I absolutely loved this book. The writing style was so incredible and so haunting, and just this was like the perfect Gothic novel. It had mystery, it had intrigue, it had sort of like a very light, spooky aspect to it, which I really appreciated. And it was so perfect for the time of year that I read it. And it's definitely one of those books that I could see myself picking up again. I feel like that's always kind of like a necessary thing for me to consider whenever I'm making my favorites of the year list, is like, would I ever want to revisit this book in the future? And if the answer is yes, then that usually means that it's definitely a book that is going to be one of my favorites of the year. And this book, I could totally see myself. It's very short, so it's super easy to consume. And it really leaves you with so many questions and so many thoughts and feelings. And I remember finishing this book and just being like, what did I read? What just happened? And it really made me think about the plot and the characters and the mystery. And I just love a lot of the discussions, or like just kind of like themes of family, of community, of like, what does it mean to be part of a community? What does it mean to be outside of a community and being like a social outcast? And what lengths would you go for the people that you love? What does trauma look like within a family? There's just so much at play here for such a short book. And I just love the way that Shirley Jackson is able to portray these themes in a concise way. I think that that's really, really impressive. If you've never read her short story, The Lottery, highly recommend doing that, because I feel like it's another example of her ability to convey like a really complex theme in a really concise way. I love it so much. So if you've never read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, I highly recommend that you do. The next book on my list is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfeld. This is another Gothic literature novel, and also kind of deals with a lot of the themes of like family and stuff like that, trauma within the family. I feel like that's a very common theme in a lot of Gothic literature, which is probably why I love it so much. But this one was really interesting. It basically follows this young woman, and she is from a family who owns a small bookstore, and she has always really been into reading and, you know, learning about different authors and stuff like that. And she ends up getting this opportunity to write the biography for a very mysterious and kind of like secluded author. And this is an author who doesn't really give any sort of interviews or stuff like that, so this is a very important opportunity. She ends up taking it and going to the author's house and ends up learning about this author's backstory, and it's really, really intriguing. I absolutely love this book. I don't typically love the structure of like, this person is going to interview this other person and you're reading this narrative, and that typically doesn't work for me, but for some reason in this book it worked perfectly. Like I really loved it. I loved the main character, I loved the author character, I loved hearing about her backstory and the way that her semi-dysfunctional, semi-weird family operated. And there's like so many family secrets, so many things that even like the author didn't know but now knows, or like doesn't know at this point, or you know, whatever. Like there's just so many different things at play in this book that I found really, really intriguing. And it also is kind of about this author's famed, infamous, sort of like mythical last book that may or may not even exist. And so I thought that was a really interesting aspect of it as well. And this story was just so perfectly told. I really liked the writing style. It was very kind of flowery and a little bit kind of like an old school writing style, if that makes sense, which I could totally see either really working or really not working for different readers. But I personally really enjoyed it. It kind of read a little bit more like a classic. So yeah, really love that one. I feel like, you know, if you want some Gothic literature, go with The 13th Tale or We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I think those are two really, really great options. I feel like I'm starting to really lose my voice. This is my second video I filmed today. The next book on this list is Oye by Melissa Mogollon, and this is the book that I read for Latina Heritage Month, and I absolutely loved it. This is one that totally took me by surprise because there's a few things that I didn't think that I would enjoy. This book does follow a high school aged character, which I was like, you know what, I'm not really into YA anymore. I don't know if I'll love this, you know, I might just like not end up liking this book. And then also this book is told only through dialogue, which I was like, okay, that's really interesting and a little bit different. And it's only told through the dialogue of the main character. You don't get to hear any other dialogue. You kind of get to just like hear her respond to other people, and she will sometimes kind of like retell what they said, but you're really only hearing from this main character. So this is like a super unique kind of book. I've never read anything else like it, and it ended up knocking it out of the park for me. I loved it so much. This main character was so funny, so witty, so like realistically a teenager. She was such like a little brat at times, which I just found so funny and so relatable, and just I could not stop listening to this book. It was so good. The audiobook, highly, highly recommend this audiobook. So good, so incredible. Basically, it follows this young Latina teenager, and she is living in a house with her two parents and her grandma, and also kind of her aunt who comes in halfway through the book. And she also has an older sister, but her older sister's at college. And so you really just get to see this family dynamic through the eyes of this teenager and through the telling of this teenager. Like, she is the only one who's talking, the only one that you really get to hear from. And I love the way that she portrays her family. I thought it was really funny. And you get to see her learn more about her family history, and you get to see her really close relationship with her grandma, who is currently going through cancer treatment and stuff like that. So you kind of get to see her grapple with losing somebody who is very important to her. And I really loved it. I thought it was so funny. I thought it was so relatable. And I could see so much of myself in this main character from like when I was a teenager. So I loved it. I thought it was incredible, fantastic, and highly, highly recommend picking up this book. If you don't pick up any of the other ones, pick up Oye. It is so good, so underrated. The next book I want to talk about is one that I could not decide between two books from this author, but I ended up going with Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. I read a lot of Abby Jimenez this year. I had never read any of her books before, but I was like, you know what? People love her books. Just for the Summer came out last year, and I'm like, I really want to get into her books. So I decided to pick up Yours Truly first, and I immediately fell in love with it. It was so good. Basically, it follows these two people who are both doctors, and they kind of get off on the wrong foot and end up having this sort of like enemies to lovers thing going on throughout the entire novel. But I will say it is kind of like a bit of a misunderstanding. So I know some people don't like a misunderstanding kind of trope thing, but I think it just worked for me in this book. I feel like Abby Jimenez is another one of those authors similar to Emily Henry, where she just knows how to write a romance book. I think some of her earlier romance books are like not quite as good, but I think anything from like Yours Truly, Just for the Summer, things like that, so good, incredible, just like chef's kiss. I loved the love interest in Yours Truly. He was so sweet and soft and just like the exact type of love interest that I have been looking for. I don't really tend to like a like super macho love interest, a super like hyper masculine love interest. It just does not work for me, whether in a book or in real life. So getting to see this love interest and see the way that he interacted with the heroine, and it was just so beautiful and so sweet and adorable. I loved it so much. The romance really worked for me. I got sold on it. It's definitely one of my new favorite romance couples, I think. Yeah, I don't even have to think about it all that long. It definitely is one of my new favorites, so highly recommend it. But I also want to say I loved Just for the Summer. Another really great book, fantastic. Just for the Summer had some really great like family dynamics in it, which I really appreciated. Some really tough family dynamics that I don't typically get to see represented in romance books. So highly recommend both of them. I feel like they kind of can both share a spot on my top 10 list for this year. I mean, it's my list, I get to make the rules. And the very last book is, I believe, the only nonfiction book on this list, and that is Singled Out: The True Story of Glenn Burke by Andrew Moranis. And this is a book about Glenn Burke. He was a baseball player and one of the first openly gay baseball players. And he's also credited as the inventor, or at least like someone who popularized the high five. He played on the Dodgers, he played on the A's, and I believe there's one other team he played for, but I can't remember what it was. But I know that like the two big teams he played for were the A's and the Dodgers. And I really loved this book. It was definitely really emotional because Glenn Burke had kind of a tough life, especially kind of like towards the end of his baseball career and then after his baseball career. I don't really want to go too deep into retelling his life story because I highly recommend picking up this book. Even if you're not into baseball or not into sports, pick it up because it does go a lot into like queer history, and it talks about his experience being a gay baseball player and dealing with homophobia within baseball, but also within just like the greater society at large. It was really good. It talks about the AIDS epidemic and that is always like a very emotional topic for me. So I really appreciated this book, and it really made me think about baseball in a different way. So highly recommend this book. I don't want to talk too much about it, like I said, because I don't really want to like spoil anything, and I think I really want people to read this book. I think it's really important, and especially if you're into baseball, especially if you're a baseball fan, read this book. I think it'll make you think about baseball in a different way. And it's really interesting, you know, being a baseball fan now, especially a queer baseball fan, and seeing how a majority of organizations have like pride nights or celebrate pride during June and stuff like that. There is one team that doesn't do that. We won't talk about them because they aren't even worth talking about, but I wish that Glenn Burke was here to like give his 2 cents about everything, you know, about like the current state of baseball, of like the way that most organizations celebrate pride. I would love to know his thoughts because he never really got to see that. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I highly recommend it, whether you're a baseball fan or you're not. I think that it is a worthwhile read. Those are all 10 of the books that I loved in 2024. It was definitely a hard list to whittle down because, like I said, quite a few books that I absolutely loved. There are plenty of honorable mentions that I could talk about. One of them I want to say is You Again by Kate Goldbeck. Loved that book. I probably should have included it on the list, but definitely an honorable mention. I had a really interesting reading year in 2024. I can't wait to see what books I end up picking up in 2025, and I can't wait to bring you guys along with me in 2025. It'll be a lot of fun. So let me know in the comments down below what books you loved in 2024. Maybe recommend me some books that I might want to pick up in 2025. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also, go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!